I need to tell you, Captain Traore is still on their radar. The agenda to have him either submit to their supervision or come to some sort of agreement with them is still in motion, because they have realized it wouldn't be possible to have mercenaries come into Burkina Faso and take him out like they've done elsewhere, because of the human shield and the vigilance of the Burkinabe people, coupled with the extra military forces from Russia and Venezuela. Ladies and gentlemen, it has so far proven to be effective, and so they've resorted to obscure and very tricky but effective assassination attacks and tactics, which has taken the lives of many great men in other parts of the world without the knowledge of how it was executed. This is their new strategy. In recent times, a man by name Viktor Yushchenko of Ukraine in 2004 organized a mass protest against electoral fraud in Ukraine at the time, and it was successful. And because of his action, Ukraine began a move towards a more democratic path. But ladies and gentlemen, the man suffered an assassination attempt on his life, not through a physical attack, but through a chemical poisoning called dioxin. He survived, by the way. This strategy is very subtle and kills slowly when not discovered early, ladies and gentlemen. Do you remember how the first president of Ghana died? President Nkrumah died of cancer, as it was officially pronounced. But his close family relatives always insisted he died of poisoning by the CIA agents. It could come from the hands you shake, your proximity with contaminated agents, or even perfume. Something similar to this is what is being plotted against the good captain of Burkina Faso. And you may be wondering where I'm getting all these information from, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'm a student of history, and I like to pry into why things are the way they are. In addition to that, I watch what's happening on the global scene and look at the numbers to see how much the Matrix is losing because of what Captain Traore and his two other comrades have done in the Sahel region. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask myself the hardest questions. My first question to myself goes like this: can the French government afford to see Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdul Rahmani in office for the next 5 years without their involvement in their governments? Can they afford it? Can the French government really stand back and watch them operate without them, ladies and gentlemen? My answer is no. And then I ask myself the next question: can the French government afford to let these military leaders gain legitimacy by way of the association with rival countries of the West? Rival countries like Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, China, and North Korea? My answer is still no. And then I ask myself the third, but the final and the most important question: can the French government watch on as these three Sahel leaders spark up a new sense of belief and hope of total liberation for the rest of Francophone African countries? Ladies and gentlemen, the answer again is in the negative. Therefore, I ask myself this: what will the French government do to shut down this or to mitigate the damages, and at the same time send a strong message to the rest of their previous colonies in Africa? Ladies and gentlemen, the answer is pretty straightforward, very simple. They will use people who claim to be freedom fighters to speak into the ears of Traore without the knowledge of his security. This is what I'm saying, and take me seriously. Captain Traore has to be very wary, careful of the so-called freedom fighters in other parts of Africa who are nothing but wolves in sheepskin. I'm referring to popular African freedom fighters who travel from one African country to the other, pretending to be preaching Pan-Africanism in support of everything Pan-Africanism is, but are secretly in association with white imperialist organizations. And I'm also referring to African Americans who comes off as Pan-Africanists and love Africa and want to relocate here and do business here, but are actually agents of the Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, the security of Traore is as important as the country Burkina Faso itself. There must not be any circumstance where any visitor, no matter who they are, sit in a radius of 10 meters from him, Do you see how Putin meets his own appointees in the Kremlin? He sits far from them, and that is because of his awareness as a former KGB agent of what a traitor can do to poison him by virtue of their proximity to him. Like the proverb goes, if they can't get you on the ground, they'll try you in the air. And that's the tactic I foresee the French government deploying against Captain Traore. In September of 1978, Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident writer, a man who dedicated his life to exposing the rot in the regime at the time, was assassinated in London via a resin-laced pellet injected into his leg using a modified umbrella. It was through an umbrella, ladies and gentlemen, meaning everything around the captain must be scrutinized, from his socks to his uniform to his face mask, underwear, anything that has direct contact to his skin must be checked, because since they seized power in the last 3 years, ladies and gentlemen, or so, there hasn't been any 50% foreign reserves deposited with the French Treasury. This is significantly affecting the overall revenue and investment capital of the French government. They are suffering because of that. Per my assessment, Burkina Faso was each year losing approximately 5 to 10 billion euros to the French government in return for their so-called currency sustenance, economic management, and protection. Similar figures were also being lost by Niger and Mali until they got out of that arrangement. And the rest of Francophone African countries are still paying till today. It is therefore important to understand that the French government will not rest until one of these two conditions are realized. One of them must be realized, according to them. Condition number one, Traore and the two other military leaders must agree to meet them and talk and negotiate on something. Condition number two, they take him out, ladies and gentlemen. There isn't a third condition, and since Traore has chosen none of the two, the pursuit is on. Burkina Faso cannot therefore afford to be complacent. They cannot afford to welcome anyone claiming to be on their side. People have interest, and when the price is right, friends will betray you. They cannot afford to give in on any conditions, ladies and gentlemen, whether Macron is there or out of office. The revolution must continue until all African countries have total control over all their resources, in effect, all their economies, ladies and gentlemen. And by the way, did you know that there was a likelihood of a coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo recently? That's one of the major reasons why their president ran to America for protection. But there is still the likelihood of a coup in 3 other Francophone African countries, and it will be a shock to France. There is a coming movement soon to demand for the rejection of the CFA franc as the currency of these Francophone African countries. A lot of changes are on the horizon as a result of the bravery of these 3 Sahel soldiers, ladies and gentlemen. Don't stand in the way and don't take the side of the imperialists whose sole agenda is to live off the resources of other countries. Don't allow for money to be used to sell your soul to the devil. Don't allow for a promise of a European citizenship and an estate home in all-white community to make you sell your people and your conscience. And don't allow for a promise of a position in a replacement government to make you help the enemy destroy what's happening in the beautiful country of Burkina Faso. You will be amazed at how efficient some African leaders can run their countries when given the free hand to work. Ladies and gentlemen, many African countries could have seen a totally different situation if not influenced by foreign elements. A man's enemies shall be members of his own household. This statement in the good book was true then and true now. Beyond the threat of assassinations coming from the outside, let's also be wary of the men on the inside, including the women. The man has already survived 19 assassination and poisoning attacks and still marching on. Let's keep the support up for Ibrahim Traore